The SCP Foundation. You've read the articles. You've played the games. You've seen the pictures. You've watched the YouTubers. Or you've listened to the you've engaged with the YouTubers. But there's still one question on the minds of every SCP fan, and I've never seen it addressed. Not here or anywhere else on the internet. The question that all SCP fans are afraid to ask. Afraid of the forbidden knowledge that they may acquire should they speak their query. But no more. Skippers, I am here to answer the SCP Foundation's oldest question. Which one of all these nerdy-ass YouTubers would be the easiest to shove into the back of a windowless van? First up, SCP Illustrated, a man that we all know and love. Famed for his spectacularly spooky work, Illustrated is SCP YouTube's resident fine artist. Also, I posit that he would be very difficult to kidnap. Why? Well, I have very little to go on in the way of physical appearance, so we're going to have to rely on other attributes. Voice, for example. I don't know how to justify this, but he sounds like the kind of person who owns a broadsword, but does not talk about it because he knows how to wield a broadsword. Really carries the vibe of someone who is like super nice, but can and will fuck your shit up. And I'm not saying that because of the accent, it is because of other reasons. Another factor, career choice. His is art, concept art, realistic art. And anyone who has ever met an artist who does realism knows that realists are nightmares who fear neither death, nor God, nor me and my van. So, it's a hair stuck to me. I predict that if I ran into SCP Illustrated in a darkened alley and attempted to shove him into the trunk, he would bite all my fingers off. He'd just bite all my fingers right off. He wouldn't even flinch. He draws realism for a living. Their entire life is pain. What's a kidnapping compared to trying to wrap your head around an ambient light source? Kidnappability rating? 3%. Very difficult to kidnap. Cimmerian. A staple of SCP YouTube, a man who looks exactly like what you would expect an SCP fan to look like. And by that, I mean he is a bearded white guy with brown hair. If you or any of your loved ones are an SCP fan who is a bearded white guy with brown hair, you owe me $5. He is most known for informing the greater SCP community about all of the things that we are wrong about. Also memes. Also, being the closest thing the SCP community has to one of those furries that talks about politics, not in terms of subject matter, but the energy is very much the same. I don't think I'm supposed to be sitting on these. My dryer just made a sound. I'm going to assume that it wasn't my fault. But how would this partial PNG tuber stack up against a nefarious scheme to shuffle him off to a second location? Considering how much Cimmerian talks about and reads SCP articles, we can assume that, like the rest of us, he's not very high on the jock end of the spectrum. I could safely assume that he cannot outrun a car. However, we need to consider this right here, the beard. What's he got in there? Rocks? He could be using it to store something very heavy, so it would be harder to get him into the trunk. Hi everybody, this is Rad from the future. I would just like to let everyone know that approximately 3 days before this video came out, Cimmerian shaved his whole beard off. So I do regret to inform you that I will have to kill him. If you're a fan, I'm sorry, but he ruined my bit, and now he has to die. But, beard storage aside, the actual hardest thing about kidnapping Cimmerian is holding on to him. Not only does this author know his way around the written word, he knows his way around the spoken one as well. And as with all SCP readers who are this deep in the lore, it only takes a spark. Unless you are in possession of an industrial strength gag capable of binding the mouths of Cerberus, you probably will find yourself completely incapable of getting him to shut the f up. The second that something reminded him of something that he read once on the Pretend Scientist website, it would be all over. It would never stop. Kidnappability rating, 5 out of 10. Easy to get, but could talk enough to make any kidnapper shove him out of the back of the van. The Sherm, TikTok darling and SCP YouTube's primary face character. Theater kid, Dance Boy speaks with the caps lock on. I predict that despite the kicks that Sherman could produce with his strong Dance Boy legs, it would be actually remarkably easy to kidnap him. He is, after all, a theater kid. And there is nothing that a theater kid loves more than drama and being the epicenter of the drama. If someone were to ever grab this DreamWorks character of a person and say, get in the van, he would probably pretend to fight just long enough to get injured enough to draw the empathy of his audience, but not injured enough to ruin his appearance in front of any prospective cameras. He'd make a big speech all about how you'll never get away with this, and he'll defeat you using the power of music or something. I don't know, I'm not a theater kid. And he would say it all loud enough to be heard from space, and every cop in the world would converge on his location within minutes. Kidnappability rating 4 out of 5 stars. Pretty kidnappable if you can get him to whisper. Let's talk about the Bung. Lord Bung. Not really a YouTuber, but definitely a proper SCP content creator. You know them from this, and also this. PNG-tuber. This prolific animator makes charming and recognizable art that gives me the unshakable vibe that if I ever tried to forcibly pick them up, they'd just go limp. Based upon my research, any attempt to shove them into your trunk would result in you having to drag their dead weight around like a corpse. It would be like kidnapping a cartoonist-sized bag of rocks. What is that noise? Hello? Are you the air conditioning? You are the air conditioning. Stop. I'm filming a video. Except the rock bag periodically mutters some suddenly deep nihilistic stuff that just annihilates you psychologically. But the most difficult hurdle about kidnapping Lord Bung would not be themselves at all. It would be fighting off the horde that would riot should any harm befall our community's beloved animator. So maybe you are strong enough to haul a grown adult's limp body from a darkened alleyway to a shipyard parking lot, but you would also have to be strong enough to single-handedly fend off the billions of rabid SCP fans thirsting for your blood. Kidnappability rating, DC 18. Pretty difficult to do. The Volgun, popularizer of SCP reading channels. Maker of 3D models. Resident cool voice haver. Bearded white guy with brown hair. I have only ever seen Mr. Volgun from about the mid-chest up, and I am not very good at evaluating people's height based on very small hints. However, any layman could hear his voice and come to the single logical conclusion regarding this man's vertical stature. He is 8 feet tall. Everybody knows that people with voices on the deeper end of the spectrum are huge. I myself am an alto, and I am 7.5 feet tall. And despite my considerable height and my very, very strong big muscles, even I would struggle to lift this giant unit into my van. If you wanted a truly good shot at making his enormous size manageable, you would probably have to shrink him down to, like, the rubber-sized. That being said, another big challenge in snatching away this titan of reading articles in a spooky voice would be his schedule. He is a very busy man. Too busy, simply too busy to be kidnapped or to respond to me on Discord. Kidnappability rating, 7. Hard to grab. If you've ever shopped for SCP merch on Etsy, then you have seen the curated works of Toad King Studios, a brown-haired white man with less of a beard. And if you've ever listened to SCP podcasts, you've probably come across Foundation After Midnight Radio, a brainchild of the aforementioned Toad King. You're probably wondering how this frogman stacks up to all of my expert kidnapping knowledge, and I am happy to tell you all about it. There are several factors that you need to take into account when dealing with this particular slippery case. Because on the one hand, he's got a real soft boy face, which leads me to believe that any kidnapper could take him in a fight. But that same soft boy face means that while you are attempting to shove him into the trunk, he might just ask you politely to stop. And he looks like such a nice guy, so it would probably be very hard to say no. Additionally, this swamp monarch lives in New York City, and as everyone in the entire world knows, New Yorkers are fazed by zero things. It also means that you would be kidnapping him from New York City, and you'd have to drive your windowless van through the streets of New York City, giving him ample time to break out and escape. It also means you would have to get him before the other kidnappers do, because there's lots of competition in New York City in the kidnapping industry. But the hardest thing about kidnapping Toad King / Eric is the fact that he only leaves his house once every 2 years. Kidnappability rating? Silver. Moderately difficult, although not impossible. Our last SCP creator is none other than current Wiki staff member and my boss, Taylor. You'll never guess what color his hair and beard are. Taylor is the same age as my little brother, which means he is a very, very small, tiny, little, small, tiny, teeny tiny baby man, 4 inches tall, maximum. Anyone who is younger than or the same age as my younger sibling is an infant and someone that I could easily pick up and crush in my epic huge meat fist, including / especially Taylor. I would simply pick him up off the sidewalk and put him into a mason jar with holes in the lid. Kidnapping successful. Kidnappability rating, A+. Easiest to kidnap so far. Now, I am not advocating for kidnapping. I certainly don't mean to imply that I mean anyone harm, or that I have clear plans drawn up to snatch all your favorite SCP content creators and make them fight to the death in a trampoline park, charging $10 for spectator admission. But I am saying that I have demonstrated the best possible methods to use if you wanted to grab any given one of them. For me, someone who has a very big smart brain and very large muscles, getting all of these professional sci-fi nerds into the back of a windowless van would be the easy part. Once I've gotten all of them in there, then I would have to surmount the real challenge, getting my driver's license